I think there's been a lot of bad acting by everyone across the board at all levels of government, and it's been a perpetual issue, and that's why we're in the situation that we're in. There's no question about it. The provincial government actually could do almost everything that it needs to do without help from other levels of government. The first apartment I rented in Toronto was extremely rare and completely illegal to build again today. Why is this building so rare, and why are there no new versions of it? What is it? Are we going to develop the corridors, or are we going to allow housing in the neighborhoods? The answer is not. Cast our cities in amber and they'll never grow again.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Rent Report podcast by Urbanation in collaboration with Rentals.ca. Today, I'm joined by Eric Lombardi, founder of More Neighbours Toronto, chair of the Toronto branch of Build Canada, and current leadership candidate for the Ontario Liberal Party. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Lovely to be here.
So, today we'll be talking mainly about housing policy, and prior to this, I was mostly familiar with you from your housing advocacy work through More Neighbours, but first let's kick it off by asking why run for Liberal Party leadership and why now?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I think the first one is big picture. Ontario has been in decline, and it has been for some time. We have some major systemic challenges in our province, and I don't see the political debate rising to the challenge of offering a real set of solutions and a vision for the future that doesn't look so much like what the last 20 years have looked like for the province. When you have a leadership opportunity like you do with the Ontario Liberal Party right now, it opens the floor to bigger ideas, new people, and new opportunities for the province at large. And particularly in this cycle, where we have a premier in Doug Ford who's becoming a bit long in the tooth and in many ways is already acting like he's half retired. I think people of Ontario are looking for their next thing. And I want to make sure that they have a real choice in doing that. And so I believe it's time for renewal. I believe people are more open than ever to new kinds of leadership. And I think that's also true with the Ontario Liberal Party itself. And so for someone like me who's been doing broader advocacy around what's gone wrong in our province related to housing, infrastructure, economic growth, the milestone recession facing young people, the erosion of excellence in our public services like education and healthcare, I see that as a great chance to shift our debate to be more solutions oriented and more ambitious about what our potential is as well. So that's what's driving me to enter this race. And it's one of the reasons why I believe Ontario can still win.
Yeah, now I believe you consulted on the previous housing plan that was put forward by Bonnie Crombie during the last election. And I remember reading it and thinking it was generally good in terms of, getting more housing built in the province, even if I didn't necessarily agree with every single piece of it. So what are the things from that plan that you would keep, and what are the things that you would change if you had free reign to make those decisions?
Well, you're going to see in the coming weeks, I'll put forward my full housing plan. I think one of the challenges that often happens in policymaking is that we err on the side of complexity in order to button up certain behaviors and things, right? So for instance, needing to put a 3,000 square foot limit on infill DC reductions, when really I just think that development charges or even land transfer taxes are a tax on growth and therefore mobility and create distortions in our housing market that ultimately don't serve the purposes of long-term affordability. And so I want to be a bit more ambitious in solving the systemic challenges. And when it comes to taxation itself, that's really about the relationship between the province and municipalities that I think in Ontario has not been productive for decades, really since the downloading era of the 1990s. And so instead of dancing around some of these, I'll have a bit more of a simpler prescription of how to solve these in a way that will make our cities whole and also enable the system itself to be simpler.
Yeah, now obviously you haven't released the new platform yet, but are there any aspects that you think would be controversial within the party or among the public?
I think there will be some aspects to my platform that will bring in controversy. I will be doing quite a bit. So I think it's worth stating first, what are the areas that need reform? And how do I think about what it means to restore the promise of home ownership, which is going to be a very big focus of my campaign? You have to address what you can do to improve demand, or that means how can young people access getting their down payments ready, getting access to mortgages, and all these things that allow them to buy their homes earlier. You've got to address supply, and that means things like land use reform, permitting reform, building code reform, etc. You've got to deal with taxes, and that's a lot of dealing with the relationship between municipalities and the province. You've got to have real solutions for non-market housing, which I believe should really make up about 20% of all the housing that we're building. And I think in many ways can be complementary to what we see in the private sector. And then you have to address the losers of change. And I think this has been one of the biggest challenges in housing policy for the last 5 years, is politicians being unable to actually state what their goal is, and then who's harmed by it. So I'll say specifically, I think a more affordable housing market requires prices to be lower, as we're already seeing in Ontario. But then that means if our deliberate policy direction is affordability by bringing prices down, then who are you hurting in that process? And to me, that's really that group of, let's call it 30 to 50-year-old Ontarians who might have bought their first home in the last 5 to 10 years and might be looking at a position where they've lost so much equity that they wouldn't even be able to move and stay as homeowners. And so there is this question of the wealth effect and downward mobility that can arise with a correction. And so if we're not willing to state that we see this as a problem, then we're not going to fix it either. And so what I'm going to be bringing forward are things like a downward mobility prevention program. I'm also going to be looking to shift the tax burden away from new home construction and onto what I'm calling speculators or land speculation. And that means I'll be introducing a kind or form of land value tax in order to replace that lost revenue. I'll also be pushing to tax capital gains on luxury home sales and large windfalls as well. But what people don't realize about a policy like that is if you recognize capital gain, it also allows you to recognize capital loss. And that's actually something a lot of people are experiencing as well. And so while I know that these solutions can be controversial, I also do think that they're really important parts of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of people who are really going to maybe jump with excitement at the idea of a land value tax being mentioned. There's a lot of, it's a very old idea, right? Georgism and the land value tax, which is to tax the sort of underlying value of the land as opposed to the improvements that are built upon it. So is that like kind of your general idea, is to tax the unproductive sources of profit and try to allow more productive sources of profitability be encouraged through the tax system?
Yeah, of course. And one of the commitments I'll also be making is a commitment to doing full tax reform. And that will include everything. But it's become necessary. We hear it all the time at how complex these systems have become. We also have these major like tax credits and subsidy challenges that I think ultimately create more complexity and result in a higher level of taxation than we would otherwise have. Because when you have complexity, you end up getting lower compliance. And there are costs to all of that I think we don't always fully appreciate. And of course, the full benefit of all of this will be more realized if it's something that we could do with the federal government as well.
Now, speaking on the topic of home prices and trying to bring them down, one issue that we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast is the cost of delivery crisis that housing developers find themselves in Ontario, particularly in the GTA, where it's just not possible right now to build units at a price that will produce any profit at market prices.
Yeah.
So the supply pipeline is starting to dry up a bit. And there's a lot of factors here. There's material costs and labor costs, land prices, financing costs, and government fees and taxes. So from your point of view, what are the highest priority items and how much can the provincial government actually do about it?
A ton. Like the provincial government actually could do almost everything that it needs to do without help from other levels of government. And I actually do think that this is one of the biggest failures in the conversation, is just how much the provincial government of Ontario has been let off the hook for the problems that we've created. So I do think it's possible through different kinds of reform that you could almost immediately bring down the cost of building a square foot of new housing by about 30% in the province. And so that will require a couple of things specifically. Number one, the fastest is to finally address the tax issue. And we have seen a lot of temporary programs to reduce the amount of development charges, etc. But what you also need to factor in is that when people buy a home, there's all the other costs that they incur in doing so. And so that's why I want to make sure that we're eliminating development charges on all housing that is infill oriented. The the Development Charge Act actually governs greenfield and infrastructure that those builders are responsible for creating first and then handing off to the city. And I don't really want to change that. I think it makes a lot of sense the way that's structured. We have to deal with the land transfer tax, which really is a tax on mobility and therefore productivity. Just because you can tax something doesn't mean that you should. And so I'm going to be getting rid of it. And then I do want to maintain the $1 million HST exemption and tie it to inflation and have it as the first 1 million, not just units that are priced below 1 million. This should address a major problem around taxes on new housing, which really do add a cost of about $150,000 to $250,000 per home, depending on what city that you're in. And that has to change. But then there's a lot of other things that matter. And a big part of the cost is risk and land. So I will be bringing forward the land speculation tax, and that will actually likely reduce land prices over the next 5 to 10 years. And I've actually included that assumption as a part of the revenue that we expect to generate from it. I do think that when we look at permitting reform and land use reform, I would like far more of the policies to be developed at the provincial level and applied locally. So Toronto does not have its own set of definitions for residential zones. Mississauga doesn't have their own. Oakville doesn't have their own. Everyone is applying the same definitions to their jurisdictions. And quite similarly, the same would be true on the permitting reports that are required to be standardized more or less across the province. Obviously, you allow some exceptions, but if you do that, you can make the system itself more transparent, and then you reduce the cottage industry tax on navigating all these differing systems between municipalities, which also improves the ability for businesses to operate at greater scale across municipalities in the province as well. And then you have building code reform. And I think a lot of people do not appreciate enough just how much our building code results in uglier buildings that are uncanny and does not distinguish in many ways between a building that is 4 stories and in 60 stories. We have a effective elevator cartel in Ontario and much of Canada. We don't allow nice single stair buildings that have been common and created great urban forms around the world and also result in nicer unit layouts, particularly in urban settings. And so once you add up all of these things, I think it's very possible without changing the cost of labor or even the cost of materials to bring down the cost of building a square foot of new housing in Ontario down by about 30 to 40%. And I think once you see that happen, you'll see more builders entering the market with new supply at lower prices, which is exactly what needs to happen.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that sort of restriction on built form is almost like an invisible tax or an invisible restriction that we don't really see how it's affecting our housing market. Because if you travel to other places around the world, you see all kinds of mid-rise, middle density housing. I had a friend who used to live in a single staircase walk up where they just had a couple of 3-bedroom apartments per floor, and it was maybe like a 3 or 4 story building. And you almost never see that anywhere here. It's extremely rare. It's kind of 2-speed. It's either townhomes or, like you said, a 60-story tower.
Yeah. The first apartment I rented in Toronto was extremely rare and completely illegal to build again today. It was probably built in 1910, and it was 3.5 stories. It had one central staircase going up, and then each floor was a 4-bedroom unit. And one of the things that got me really into the specifics of housing policy was wondering, why is this building so rare and why are there no new versions of it? And then you learn about how we've changed uh, planning, urban design, and all these things that ended up thwarting a form of housing that's actually really nice to live in. Because all sides of the apartment get sunlight. There's a lot of really great cross ventilation, and I just found it inexcusable. And when I went and looked back, and by the way, this was in an area called Kensington Market, which is a pretty famous Toronto neighborhood. It's very downtown. And when I looked at the zoning designation for that apartment, it was actually downzoned. So you would only be allowed to build a townhouse on it, even though a 3.5 story apartment building technically existed on it today. And that's emblematic of how we ended up in the situation that we're in.
Yeah, well, let's get into this right now then. So one of the most controversial parts of housing plans tends to be zoning reform. We saw this to be a hugely controversial thing when Calgary was doing their affordable housing plan. And it's because zoning is often used as a lever by people who are opposed to new development in their neighborhood. There's been some movement from the province of Ontario to push reforms like Bill 23 back in 2022, but do you think that goes far enough? And how do you view the balance between provincial oversight and municipal autonomy?
Look, I think we need to base. So, okay, I guess there's a couple comments. Firstly, I do think that there are people who have valid concerns about encroaching densification in their neighborhoods, and I get the knee-jerk reaction to change. But I also think that there's a conversation to be had about property rights. And in many ways, like people should be able to do reasonable things with their property, including adding housing to their property, if it doesn't require local infrastructure improvements. And if people do not like some of the changes happening to their neighborhoods, then it should also be very relatively easy to move, which is exactly why burdens like the LTT end up trapping people in place as well. And so I do think that we need to have a lens on this, that places should change. And that also, if places are changing, it's also easy for you to also vote with your feet to move somewhere where you think it'll be better and more stable. But I will also say our leaders in this country have completely mismanaged urban order over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think that's one of the reasons why people have a lot of skepticism. When I go to places like London, Ontario, which I was in 2 weeks ago, and I was walking downtown, the amount of people with challenges on drug addiction and mental health resulting in homelessness was omnipresent. And it was almost like we went into a place where an apocalypse had happened and no one had bothered to tell the provincial and national media that this happened. And when I went to go speak with liberals there, I said, I'm so sorry what's happened here. Like downtown London is a catastrophe. And they're like, yeah, we know. None of us go there anymore. And if this is how people in so many parts of whether it's Toronto or the rest of Ontario or the rest of Canada perceive what urbanization is going to bring to their neighborhoods, well, of course they're going to be against it. And so there is also this mandate of just good governance that we've completely failed at, which has meant that people don't want to see any forms of urbanization in the suburban neighborhoods that they live in. And so I don't blame them for that. But when it comes to what I think we should have is yes, like I believe that people should be able to build 4 units on their property. I think that that should be the bare minimum. I do think that if people want to protect more of the urban cores, there's this big battle in Toronto happening over sneaky Ds. Well, what is it? Are we going to develop the corridors, or are we going to allow housing in the neighborhoods? The answer is not cast our cities in amber and they'll never grow again. So I think that people have not been forced to deal with the trade-offs of this dialogue. And I think that as leaders, we need to do a better job of having the real conversations and making those trade-offs clearer and the promises to rectify them.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up sneaky D's because I think that is also, it can be a consequence of this sort of two-speed zoning that we tend to do in Canada. Another example that came up, this was in Calgary again, was a music venue called the Blues Can that is being shut down to make way for a condo tower. And, that's one of those things that makes people upset with development. But the reason that they're building it in that spot is because it's one of the very few places that's zoned for that kind of construction. And on the other side, on the back side of that same block, right? It's there's no sidewalk or road separating them. It's just an alleyway. There's R2 zoning, right? So you can't walk around the block and build the same tower. It has to be on this main thoroughfare, and so it ends up displacing these older, institutions or cultural places that make the neighborhood what it is in the first place. And it's
Absolutely.
just because we don't allow housing to be built anywhere else.
Well, I think there's been three fundamental failures, and I think many of these are true across Canada, but I can address them specifically in Ontario. So, failure number one. Um, in the 1990s, we did have a major fiscal crisis that resulted in a lot of downloading from the federal government to the provincial government, and then the downloading of responsibilities from provincial governments to municipalities without additional revenue sources. And so you saw cities become more responsible for housing, major infrastructure, um, even like health networks, which, especially in rural Ontario, now make up to 20% of regional budgets are on health services, which really should be paid for provincially. And then number two is we had the growth planning reforms from 2003 to 2006, same reforms that created the Greenbelt. And I'm not saying I'm against the Greenbelt. I do think that we need to preserve important ecological and agricultural land, especially around the GTA. And but the outcome was, and I guess the third one before I get to the outcomes of all of this is completely inadequate transportation infrastructure planning, which in Toronto, we've basically stopped building new rail for 50 years. And then we lost that capability. And then we had a couple of hiccups in early 2000s delivery that resulted in even more broken system for delivering infrastructure. And so the outcome of all of these things has meant that we've shifted how we build from being about 70% low-rise forms, single-family homes, townhomes, to over 70% high-rise multifamily. And when you look at the difference between those kind of projects, single-family homes and townhomes are usually projects that can be built in a year and a half, if not less time. High-rise, they're typically 3 to 5+ cycles. And if you think about individuals who intend to live somewhere, well, most people don't make housing decisions on a 5-year time frame. They think maybe 1 or 2 years. And then people are like, well, why aren't we building more 3-bedroom plus condos? Well, families aren't looking to wait for a condo for 5 years. Why is it that so many speculators and um, investors are dominating new supply in our market? Well, it's because what you build is a long-term cycle, and most families don't think about that as that kind of basis. And so we've resulted in all these delusions about why we ended up with the problem that we have. And so what's fundamental to me is that the government itself stops trying to bias what we build so much. So if people want to live on the ground in a single family home, we've got to be building these suburbs. If more people want to be living urban in multiplexes, well, we've got to make that choice an easy one to make. And it's like we've made all the choices that ordinary people could make about how they live something that they can't choose, and that has to change.
Speaking about built forms and intended markets, in terms of new supply, we've seen a major shift in the past few years. A significant drop in new condo starts as unsold condo inventory is piling up. But at the same time, we've seen a bit of a renaissance in purpose-built rental construction, which Canada and particularly Ontario were missing for decades. However, I have seen some concern from people who think this trend is pushing homeownership further out of reach. Do you have an opinion on that? And should the government be tipping the scales one way or the other in terms of rental or ownership?
Well, the reason why we're seeing a huge uptick in purpose-built rentals is, some good things and some things that, I think we should go all the way on. So the good news is that governments are actually just spending more money to put equity to seed new purpose rental builds, especially with nonprofit providers or with developer partners for which there's going to be like an affordability component, etc. And I don't really have a huge problem with that. But one of the reasons why you're also seeing private capital crowd more into that is we actually did all the tax cuts and levers for purposeful rental that we haven't given to homeownership. So then if you're going to be selling into markets, well, now you have a disincentive to head towards building for home ownership. But I also just genuinely believe that a lot of people who want to own homes want to do it for a longer term home. The cost of moving is quite substantial when you look at all the costs. And so we have not even really given an outlet in the kinds of supply that we're creating for home ownership forms as well. And so that does need to change. And for me, and I think, I don't know how many young people I am speaking for here, we were never asked if we were wanting to become a renter society. I think many young people and many renters still aspire to home ownership. And I think we've almost been taken over by this like progressive academic class that wants to just tell everyone that, um, do you know what? Like homeownership is a gauche value that, you know, was reminiscent of a former time, and that time is gone. So let's just focus on making sure that people know that it's fine to rent forever. And, there are a lot of financial reasons why that can make sense. And that just fully detaches from the way that people culturally want to live, the value that people see in being able to change their own home and that feeling of having that stake in society and the ability to raise your kids and children in a home that is the family home. And all of these things have become totally non-factors in the conversation. I think that that is an enormous mistake. And so the heavy focus of what I'm going to be on is that actually this dream matters and it's not just for economic reasons. And then it's time for us to make home ownership a viable dream to the vast majority of the upcoming middle class of our generation, but specifically for the one that comes next. Because I really do think that millennials as a group in particular, we're not going to have the living standards that the last generation was able to afford and enjoy. Many of us will miss some of the important milestones like having families and kids and all of this that I think under different conditions would have been greater. But I do think it will be our generation's responsibility to make sure that the next generation does not have those barriers that we had. And that's actually part of my motive for running as well.
In terms of reducing barriers to new housing, I wanted to circle back on development charges and land transfer taxes. Do you think that provincial subsidization of these charges and fees, like we've seen in Ontario and BC, could be, in a sense, rewarding bad behavior from municipalities who became overly reliant on those revenue sources during the price boom instead of just raising property taxes to fund new spending?
So I think there's been a lot of bad acting by everyone across the board at all levels of government, and it's been a perpetual issue. And that's why we're in the situation that we're in. There's no question about it. But to me, fixing this issue does not look like punishing municipalities. It's acknowledging what isn't working and then making everyone whole through change and making the province carry that burden. So, yes, will I be getting rid of development charges? Absolutely. Will I be specifically preventing municipalities from using them in the same way? Yes. But how will I make up for it? And I think that's an important question. And I am committed to giving cities 1% of the 13% of the HST in perpetuity. And that actually is more revenue than is being raised by development charges today. And it's a far more consistent form of revenue for cities. And then I'll also allow them to do other things like tax increment financing, the greater use of municipal development corporations to amortize utility expansion costs. All of these things that should actually bring down the costs that need to be imposed on new development, and in many ways take off the pressure that would otherwise go onto the property tax base. I'll also be uploading the costs that cities are incurring for housing and health services, which shouldn't have been their responsibility in the first place. And so when I look at all of the things in my platform, cities are going to come out more than whole. I will probably pare back some of the bespoke funding arrangements that the province makes. I really don't like that as the approach for accountability purposes. I think cities need far more bandwidth to be able to execute on their own priorities without going cap in hand to the provincial government or the federal government. And I actually don't think it's healthy when we're creating all these one-off sort of bribe-oriented policy systems that are almost always unenforceable. And you can see that in like the Housing Accelerator Fund money that was doled out by Trudeau administration, which in many ways is being abandoned by the cities that took the money. And so I want everyone to have clear lanes of accountability and the financial resources to do what their mandate from their voters are to do. And this era of every politician from every level of government trying to chip in 1/3 and pissing on the same fire hydrant, well, it's got to end. It's just creating dysfunction, and that's really what I want to change.
Yeah. Now, one of the plans that's kind of a hot topic in the news these days is the BC housing plan, which something similar is happening in Ontario as well, where basically the government is purchasing unsold condo inventory and trying to convert it to affordable housing in one way or another, either as rentals or sort of rent to buy scheme. So, what are your thoughts on that plan? Do you think it's a good idea, or should that capital be allocated elsewhere?
I think it's a bad idea. In fact, I think it's such a bad idea that it would be better to not spend the money at all than to reallocate it to something else. But if I were to reallocate it to something else, I'll be specific about what I would like to see. Any money that is going to spur on the development of affordable or rent geared income, any or shelter housing, etc., should be for net new builds. And that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, for the existing condo units that are on the market today, we need to allow them to find their market price. I do not like a system in which we are going to choose the appropriate developers to buy in bulk from. Their condo units were designed by them, and good units still sell. So it's between them and their lenders about what they want to do with it. Some of them could find their way to the rental market if the developer doesn't want to sell that unit at that time. And others might find their way to being on the market for a price below the cost of what they paid to construct it. And that was a risk that they took with their lenders, and that's up to them to resolve. But I think at the end of the day, we should not reward potentially bad behavior with a bailout or a subsidy. I believe in markets, and I believe what needs to happen through a correction is to also take out and have everyone in the system adjust to a new reality. And if we bail out people through that process, we actually don't allow markets and prices to adjust to where they need to be. And so that's why doing nothing will actually do more for affordability than taking supply off of the market that will inherently keep the price floor higher, because that's what happens. And then that money should be used to spur equity investments into new construction. And that can be through nonprofit organizations, that can be through others. But then you get all the benefits of all of the activity that that money is spurring as well. All the construction and skilled labor that right now is finding itself increasingly unemployed because we don't see projects going forward, right? So even if you're looking at the value of that money, it's so much more valuable to be spent on something that is towards building than taking up capacity of what's already been built over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to me because personally, I can see an argument where if the government was going to buy it and retain it as non market rental housing, you could say there is an argument for them to buy unsold condo inventory if it's below the cost of construction because they have some mandate to procure X number of units, and this might be the cheapest way to do it. But when they gave more details and they said it's a rent to buy scheme, I really am not sure what the argument for that is. It seems a lot like when we had 40-year zero down mortgages insured through the CMHC, but with extra steps and the government kind of stepping in to buy and sell the property as an intermediary.
Yep, and it's going to all go to the right people who were determined are eligible for the right kind of lottery, and isn't that all fun? I know everyone in our generation just would love the idea that the housing future in Canada is waiting on a list to get social housing and being one of the lucky winners when you're 50. I think all of this is extraordinarily um, unhealthy for our society in the way that we are approaching it. And so I think the mandate of government is to be clearer about making the market serve the masses, which it currently doesn't. And that is a government failure, not a market fail, not the failure of the market. And then we have to do things for the 20% of the market to help people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get access to suitable housing. and for those who are struggling with it today. And to me, that looks far more deliberate in spurring new investment and helping nonprofits and co-ops, etc., expand than buying off condo units from private builders who should have managed their risk and their plans better.
Okay, now changing topics a bit, I want to talk a bit about international students because Urbanation just released a very extensive report on purpose-built student rental housing in Ontario, and obviously the international student population has a big impact on that as well as the overall rental market. And one of the things that we found when looking into the data was that there's been a pretty big change in enrollment at colleges in Ontario because they were proportionally much more of a part of the increase in the international student population. So, what do you think Ontario should do to solve the issues with post secondary funding, which international students were used as a source of a lot of their funding for quite a few years there? So, what do you think that Ontario should be doing to solve those issues that are coming from a decline in the international student population?
So, I mean, I think some of this is a necessary correction, and there are a lot of institutions that should have known better. So, I'll actually be specific. I will be bringing forward a recommendation to cap undergraduate international student enrollment to 10% of the domestic enrollment at any given public college or university in the province. And by the way, when we look at the university sector, they really did not go down this path as much as the college and private college sector did. So even like Queen's or the University of Waterloo or the University of Toronto see undergraduate enrollment at under or around 10%. And similarly, I'm going to uncap graduate programs, but I'm actually going to ban international students from private colleges. I think that entire system has been abused. And our private college system, I think, you know what, it's great, but really it should serve, you know, adult education, credentials, etc. And I think that we need to orient the system itself to um, bringing the best and brightest to finish their degrees or get their master's and PhD here at our top schools. And I think that's what it used to be. And that's where we need to get to again. And then, yes, many, especially the private college system, will struggle through that change. But I think that change is necessary and we're going to have to just course correct on it. And then beyond that, I'll be putting in more funding for the system itself. And in particular, I'll be bringing forward what I call free tuition with a catch, which for any student who requires an OSAP loan to pay for their tuition, if they stay in Ontario after they graduate, we'll forgive that loan over the next 10 years so that they can focus on saving and building their life in the province. And that's part of the new deal that I'm trying to offer young Ontarians as well.
Yeah, and to provide some extra context for viewers, I think, it may sound radical to ban international students from private colleges, but it's actually a fairly new thing. Like these public college private partnerships, PCPPs, were, I believe, introduced in the early 2010s, and they were going to be unwound in 2017 until the decision was reversed after the election. And that was based on a report saying that there was very little oversight or quality control in any of those programs. So I do think there is an argument for unwinding that. And I think, to a great extent, the justification for keeping it was to allow international student money to be flowing through the GTA, through these private institutions out to colleges that are outside the GTA.
Yep. And I think, it's been a Ponzi scheme. That's really what it's been. We've got to acknowledge that that's what we did, that it was a mistake, and we need to course correct it. And I think that will also restore people's trust in higher education more too.
Okay, well, we're running close to time here, so I'll give you one last kind of open-ended question here. If you could make one zoning or building code change, like if you just had like your fantasy quarterback decision, what would it be?
I mean, I would like to see us do proper building code reform. And that means like allowing smaller elevator standards. That means single egress standards being allowed to higher heights, whether it's 6 or 12 stories, etc. Because people do not realize how much the building code affects how nice or ugly the buildings that we build are. And I think that there would be far more consensus and far more openness to growth if what we were building in Ontario was beautiful. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we see around NIMBYism is that very often people object, I think, to these other qualities of the buildings that are coming to their neighborhood. And if the things that were being put forward were nicer, there would actually be way less hostility to that kind of growth. And so I actually do think that beauty is an underrated value in how we approach building our housing future. And it will be a priority for me personally to ensure that the system that we have results in more enduring outcomes for the long term that make people feel that they live in a society that values itself. And I think the way that we build new places has a tremendous impact on that feeling. And so that's what I would pursue.
It is true. I've seen studies that have said that local opposition to newer development and new density tends to plummet when the buildings have more traditional architecture and exteriors.
Yep. And I think, there's been this trend in architectural thinking that, oh, this brutalist design that is highly functional, it challenges the, you know, um, regular people to think differently about the standards of beauty and all this stuff. And it's like, actually, you know what we shouldn't be doing? Challenging people. I actually think people intuitively understand something to be beautiful quite easily. And the objective of what we build and design should be objectively beautiful in a simple way. And I think sometimes we lose the simple lessons in how we approach things. And I think the entire industry is finally starting to reconcile that it has some responsibility here as well.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode. So, Eric, thanks for joining. And why don't you let the audience know where they can find you if they want to know more?
Yeah, if you want to know more about what I'm proposing as part of my leadership campaign, please stay tuned to ericforolp.ca. And when it comes to my platform, it'll actually be up shortly after the Canada Day long weekend. So stay tuned and reach out to us through our website, get involved, make a donation, sign up for membership if you live in Ontario. I do think that people are ready for more substantial change.
All right. Well, thanks again. And thanks everyone for listening.